Hi, I'm Marlon James. I am a writer and novelist, and I am the creator of this show, Get Millie Black. So, Get Millie Black is about a Jamaican detective who, when she was 9, got sent to the UK to live here. This is where, the UK is where she became a cop. And she became a cop because she's haunted by the past. And in a way, she's seeking a sort of atonement, a sort of redemption for what she feels, where she feels she may have failed. And she becomes a detective on a kind of righteous mission to mostly save children. A series of really remarkable events happened, and a character, her brother, who she thought was dead, ends up being alive. And that sends her immediately back to Jamaica. Not just to find her brother, but to find the version of her that she lost when she came to the UK. And as someone who lived in Jamaica but not long enough, and lived in the UK but not long enough, she's sort of a citizen of both, but she belongs to neither. And she ends up in a case that keeps mutating in a way. One missing person leads to another missing person. One mystery leads to another mystery. Solving one just opens up another. And before we know it, Millie's right back where she started to solve the ultimate mystery that was right in front of her. Even when I was writing novels, I look at fiction writing as a sort of detective work. Part of that is because my mother was a detective. And I'm sure she's out there saying Millie's based on her. It is not, Mommy. But it is based on sort of growing up in a house where detective work was always happening. And for me, writing books is solving mysteries. Characters appear, and I want to know what they're all about. And with Millie as well, to me, it was just it was almost inevitable that as somebody like myself who tries to solve mysteries that I'm writing would eventually write a detective story. I'm also very much inspired by detective stories. I think my favorite American novel is American Tabloid. I'm a big fan of the crime writers. I've been reading, Ian Rankin from when I was a teenager. A big fan of Tana French, Denise Mina. So I've always gravitated towards detective stories, and for me it was just inevitable. So usually my novels have a lot of perspectives and a lot of points of view. They sometimes have dozens of characters, and a lot of classic detective stories, focus on Sam Spade or, Philip Marlowe or that one person. But at the same time, crime novels, detective stories also really involve the community. And a crime isn't a singular event. A lot of times my stories just turn that inside out, where we start with the community and then zoom in, as opposed to start with a singular event and then open out. So to me, it eventually is the same kind of story. It's just told in a different point of view. It starts, as I said, most of my stories start wide and then narrow. This starts narrow and then widens. But ultimately, it covers the same kind of space. One of the things I like about noir stories are when they're narrated. So it's not almost, it is a story of somebody telling a story. And but I was thinking, how do you subvert that for a show like Millie? And that's when the idea came that each story would be narrated by somebody else. People who have known Millie all their lives, the people who have only known her for 5 minutes. And in a way, those different perspectives add up to one perspective because, nobody's ever one story. And when through showing so many different sides to her, I think a more sort of complete vision of her emerges. At the same time, these are 5 different opinions. Yeah, even I always said to somebody, even a memoir is just somebody's opinion. So it leaves it open as to what to believe about her and what should you take as definitive about her personality. And that's something I do even in the fiction I write. I tend to leave a lot of the judgment about characters to the reader or to the viewer. I don't make them. Jamaica is a former British colony, and if we're going to talk about colonization, we're going to talk about hundreds of thousands of ghosts. I don't know how I describe this for somebody living here, that a lot of the collateral damage of colonialism is still in the colonies, quote unquote. A lot of the attitudes are still in the colonies. I didn't realize until the first time I came to the UK that when I opened my mouth, I sound like the butler, because I learned colonial English. And colonial English is a lot more servile than, UK English. It's a lot more passive voices. It's a lot more indefinite terms. It's a lot more suggestive rather than declarative. So even that in itself is kind of, if not a ghost, a haunting. And I think when you're in countries like Jamaica or Puerto Rico or anywhere where there was colonialism, anywhere where there's a history of slavery and stuff like that, you're going to have just a bunch of ghosts speaking to you. Growing up in Jamaica, we also, take ghosts for real. We take the living and the dead as almost being equally participatory in our lives.
Superintendent Luke Holborn of Scotland Yard.
Detective Millie Black. Well, you come to colonize our case?
It was very important to me that the show was set in Jamaica. For one, most of my stories are set in Jamaica. I think it was important to show the country as a place that's complicated and contradictory, that the country itself is a character. I think sometimes even a positive stereotypical view of the country is still a stereotype. Yes, we have beautiful beaches and wonderful people, but things go bump in the night and things happen, and, there are murders and there are mysteries and there are things that we can't solve, and it's complicated. And I think a complicated view of our country is a rich view of our country. I think there's a fear sometimes with shows like these. I think a lot of people fear we falling into stereotypes or fall into a sort of negative picture of the country. I don't think it's a job of art to be positive or negative. I think we do something that's close to some sort of truth, and build from there. And for me, the important thing was that Jamaica was a place where drama happens and where the story, goes in a different direction than where it began. It'd be very easy to have swaying palm trees and people drinking coconut water. Well, we do that. But it was more important that the country itself adds to the complexity of the story. Get Millie Black is not just a Jamaica show, it's a Kingston show. So it was very important for me that it stayed urban. Pretty much all the scenes, I think maybe one wasn't shot in Kingston, it was shot just in the bay overlooking Kingston. Because it's a city story, it's a detective story, and most of what the world knows about Jamaica tends to be rural. Or they hear, usually with Jamaica, you see the beach or ghetto. And here it was a lot of how the middle class lives, how the working class lives, what Kingston looks like now as opposed to 50, 60, 100 years ago. There's more to Kingston than, say, going downtown with 15 speakers out in the road and doing sound clash, which is great. That is Jamaica too. But the thing that about Millie, and you see it from the very first episode, is that there is no one place you can call Kingston, and there's no one look or one style or even one social class. One of the first things that Millie says in the very first episode is, do you know how it feels when the living haunts you? And Millie is a lot of things, but more than anything else, she's haunted. I think she is haunted by the ghost of her brother. At one point in the show, not in the show, at one point in the story, Millie is told that her brother is dead. And that death shapes her whole worldview. It shapes her career path. It shapes how she defines herself. In a lot of ways, Millie is trying to save the boy she couldn't save. And that's a huge part of what drives her. Does it become an obsession? You probably have to watch the show and judge for yourself. But it does shape almost everything about her. Definitely, ultimately to her disadvantage. I think Millie is driven. And everything that's essentially good has consequences if you take it too far. So Millie at her best is driven. Millie at her worst is obsessed. And at certain points in the show, one overrides the other. And it's a continual seesaw until she makes a final decision in the last 2 episodes what to do. But she is haunted by the past. She's very much living in the present, but she reminds me of me, actually, in the sense that every time I open my eyes, I think I'm seeing behind me. In the sense that I'm reckoning with history, reckoning with my own past, and you can't really move forward in Jamaica without looking back. Her position as insider and outsider, I think, gives her perspective. It gives her a wider worldview than most of the people she's around. It sometimes means, though, that she doesn't see what's happening right in front of her. Because she's so big at the expansive, wide view, that sometimes, and it's one of the things her loved one says, is the things right in front of her that she doesn't see. And then I think that in some ways is both her sort of virtue and flaw as a character. If you're gonna write about anything, for me, writing about Jamaica, whether it's Millie or any of my other characters, you kind of have to be inside and outside at the same time. There's this sort of double consciousness, particularly when you're in the Caribbean, even when you're in the diaspora. Black communities, black and brown communities in the UK know all about code switching and know all about the different languages you employ during the day. If I'm hanging out in London with Caribbean people, it's always funny to me how they speak when different people enter and leave the room. Because they have different languages for different people, and it's just how we are, and it's how we have learned to navigate the spaces that we're in. I don't think Millie expected to be navigating so many spaces coming back to her own home country. But being back there, she is kind of too British for Jamaica and too Jamaica for Britain, which leaves her in a kind of, it leaves her in her own space. And that's not always bad, but it sometimes makes her sort of disconnect, I think, from the world around her. Funny enough, it was a Channel 4 documentary that gave me the idea for Hibiscus. They, very early on, I think maybe early 2000s, late 90s, I can't remember, did a short feature on the Gully Queens.
Tonight on Unreported World, how it's dangerous to be gay in Jamaica.
In Jamaica, there were trans and queer, honestly, children, really. They were really very young. And they were living in the gutters in Jamaica. And on one hand, we're talking the very dregs of society. You couldn't be any lower in Jamaica than being in a gully. But on the other hand, they created their own little world of wonder. It was almost like a Jamaican version of the ballroom scene in Harlem. They found scraps in the trash heap. They found scraps people tossed away and made their own dresses and made their own costumes. I always say it was like the most fabulous Mad Max set ever. And they built this world, but at the same time, every now and then, you get a glimpse of the world that tosses them aside. And you get a glimpse of the world that sometimes comes to them for sex, because there's a lot of sex work that was going on, but use them and toss them away. And there was a character in it who they focused on, and she was trying so desperately to hold on to hope. And she's speaking to the camera saying, I know God have some better plans for me. And she's just crying. And because she has nothing else. All she has is the hope that it must get better than this. And I remember just bursting out crying. And it's funny, I remember years ago, I was explaining this to some people at Channel 4 and actually started crying in the room as well. Because I was just so haunted by that character. So in a lot of ways, Hibiscus was with me before even Millie. And I knew that she would be a character, and I knew I wanted to talk about the very, very high heights of Jamaican society, but the lows as well. When you're in a country like Jamaica, one of the things about colonial societies is in a lot of ways they hold on to stuff that the British may have let go. There are aspects of Jamaican society that are still very Victorian, certainly very Georgian. The ideas of class, the idea of we don't talk about certain things. And in that kind of society, that kind of sort of repressive society, secret societies happen, and things that happen would only happen in the dark. I used to say, I teach Victorian lit, and one of the things I teach about Victorian society is, Victorian society is a kind where Jack the Ripper had to happen. He's the most inevitable outgrowth of Victorian society, because a society that pushes people to the margins and pushes people into secret then develops people who exploit that, who brutalize that, who victimize people out of that. And that's what the Gully Queens are, and that's who Hibiscus is. The thing about Hibiscus and women and men and boys and girls like them is that they don't have time for your pity. They're too busy surviving and thriving and being fabulous. So, hell, they'll take your money, but you can keep your pity. As an LGBT person myself, visibility to me was important. And it was very important to show, one, that there's more to Jamaica than our very infamous homophobia. That despite all of that, queer communities survive. There are different visions of queer life in Millie. And they all find a way of surviving. They find a way of finding joy. They find a way of living with whatever normal society is. And at some point, the different types of queer characters all decide to be themselves. They're all faced with the dilemma of, do I destroy who I am to live in the world as it is? And they all decide no. And I think that's reflective of a lot of what's going on in Jamaica now. That said, there are some pretty brutal reprisals against gay people in the show. We're not kidding ourselves. I think Jamaica has come a long way, but I think it has a long way to go. I think that on one hand, gay men and gay women feel more visible than ever and feel freer than ever. On the other hand, trans women are fleeing and seeking political asylum in droves. So it's still a best of times, worst of times, but I will say that the best is starting to eclipse the worst. I think it goes without saying, anybody with even a basic knowledge of queer life, whether in the UK, Jamaica, or whoever, they know about found families. They know about the families you build. And in some ways, they're stronger than the families you came from, particularly when that family rejects you. So there's a lot of that in Get Millie Black. Hibiscus finds family. Hibiscus helps create family. Millie represents family that's blood, but that blood, either was never there or couldn't be depended on, or they were the enemy. So there is that struggle. I think Millie tries her best to be the sister that she thinks she couldn't have been, even though Hibiscus doesn't blame her for the life that they both ended up living. Millie is trying to grab for a vision of family that may not exactly work. People make families, and sometimes that's stronger. I know as a queer person, I also had to build my own family. Before my own family is great now, and they're accepting and loving and so on, but there was that time when, I had an alternative brothers, I had alternative sisters, I had an alternative mother in New York, and you take support where you can get it. Millie wants to be that person. Millie wants to be that support. Millie wants to be a big sister. But the question is, who does she want to be a big sister to? And I think that's the dilemma. I mean, it's almost a cliche to say Jamaica is a very musical society. We do everything to a soundtrack. But at the same time, reggae, particularly 70s, 80s reggae, for a lot of writers like myself, that was the first time we know we could use the language that's coming out of our mouths to say complicated things. Usually in the past, when characters are speaking Jamaican English, when they're speaking patois, it's slapstick. And that's fine, because sometimes that slapstick is layered with irony. But more often than not, it's just sort of an invitation to a certain kind of, let's just have some sort of fun in a kind of a step and fetch it kind of way. It was the reggae singers that started to use Jamaican patois to talk about complicated things. Like relationships, like colonialism, like violence, like politics. And I think any Jamaican writer who ends up depending on voice as much as I do owes reggae a big debt. And so I knew that if not just the lyricism of the music, that the soundtrack would be heavily Jamaican music, that the theme that runs through the show is based on reggae and dub music. I think that Jamaican music, particularly dub in this case, just kind of creates a space that you can inhabit. I certainly had a vision for how the show would sound. One, because I didn't make music, but I did come out of that industry. I used to be an art director and stuff like that, and most of my friends are in music. Not just the sound of Jamaican music here, but if it's a show that impacts Caribbean communities in the UK, then it's also going to show music that reflects the diaspora. It's going to show music from Bristol. It's gonna touch on stuff like Massive Attack and trip hop and jungle and all the kind of musics that Caribbean communities, that Jamaican communities outside of Jamaica also make. And then at some point, and I think it's most of the theme that does this, there is a kind of a bridge between let's call it Jamaica and the rock, on the Jamaica and the rock and the Jamaica and the diaspora type of music, and what happens when they emerge. I mean, there are a lot of ways of answering that question about moments that made me want to be a writer. I guess the best way to answer that is books that made me want to write books. And I remember the first time I read this novel, Dog Eaters, by Jessica Hagedorn. And even though there does another edition and they have a blurb from me in the back that says this is the best novel about Jamaica ever written, except it's set in the Philippines. We talk about the universal languages of literature, but that was the first time I read a novel that's set in a world totally different from mine and totally saw myself in it. If you're from the Philippines, if you're from Manila, or you're from Kingston, or you're from Mexico City, or you're from Cape Town, you kind of grew up in the same place. And the thing about these places, I always say this, you're always caught between two things, a political election and a beauty contest. And if you're in that world, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So a book like Dog Eaters made me realize the world I was living in was worth talking about, was worth telling stories about. So you have books like that. And then you have things that writers say, like Gabriel Garcia Marquez talks about being given permission to write, about if you're a writer, eventually you encounter that story, that book, where you go, I can't believe you did this, or you're not supposed to do that. And what it does is, in a way, it liberates how you write. Like Marquez did that for me, and Kafka did that for Marquez. Marquez talks about reading a story about a man waking up and he's turned into an insect. And he's like, you can't turn into an insect. That doesn't happen. But it explodes the whole idea of possibility. That inspires him, and that's what inspired me. I'm always inspired. Like, I read dozens of books when I'm writing. And I come across people who say things like they don't read when they write because they don't want to be influenced. I'm like, you can only hope. It's like, I love being influenced by what I was writing. I know exactly, there's a section in a book I wrote, which is an African fantasy novel, but I can tell which parts I was reading K Tempest while I was writing it. I can still tell, I was reading K's novel when I wrote that part. Because I think, it's what Cormac McCarthy says, that books come out of books. I don't get writers who are not curious. I don't understand that. I think if you're going to be a writer, artistically at least, you can't grow up. And you also have to be curious. And I walk around my influences all the time. If you grab, not that bag right there, but most often than not, I am walking around with something from Hilary Mantel and something from Toni Morrison. And I'm just constantly reading it, if for nothing, just to get some sort of instant inspiration. I don't know if this is a Gen X thing, but in a lot of ways, we were raised by TV. It's not a knock on my parents to say that Sesame Street raised me. And we grew up with, it's hilarious talking to my students now about MTV. They have no idea why would you have a channel with music all the time. They have no idea, these kids. But I grew up with TV doing the babysitting, taking up a lot of the time, and particularly 80s TV, which I'm still inspired by, and 70s TV. Get Millie Black, in some ways, an homage to this show, Get Christy Love, which came on in the 70s. It was a TV attempt at a kind of at the blaxploitation genre. It only lasted one season, but I never forgot it. Funny enough, ironically enough, a lot of this sort of multi-character storytelling that I bring in my novels, I got from TV. Whether it's even something like soap operas, I'm a big defender of soap operas. I love them. I have no snobbery when it comes to television and books. It's like I tell you, I'm not a snob. I can't afford it. You watch what's on TV, so it's whether it's Dallas or NYPD Blue or there used to be this British show Ultraviolet, which I loved. I think it was like the best vampire show ever. This is the thing about television and film in general. You have to be economical. As a novelist, my books can take up hundreds of pages. A script is like 48 pages, and that's a long one. So you learn brevity, you learn economy, you learn to focus on what's really important in a story, and that's what TV shows and TV writing taught me. I'll say this. I think a lot of times the detectives on TV who get the privilege of being super flawed tend to be men. And I think there is this fear of making women unlikable. There is this fear of giving them irredeemable qualities. And I've never been scared of that in fiction or in anything I write. And for me, it was important for Millie as well, that Millie makes mistakes, that Millie makes errors in judgment. Sometimes it's not her head it's not her head that's heading into a situation, it's her heart. And sometimes the other way around. And it was very important for me that somebody with flaws, some of them negotiable, some of them crippling, are an essential part of her nature and an essential part of what makes her the detective she is. So my favorite books as a teenager, God, I'm killing my writer's cred right now. I really love Jackie Collins. Oh my God. I loved Hollywood Wives. Hollywood Wives is the first book I ever read in one sitting. And I remember, I was thinking maybe 14, which is not the age I should be reading that book. No, 13, which is even worse. And I remember I started reading it like 2 p.m. on a Monday, and I finished it like 11 a.m. the Tuesday. There's a whole part about faking being sick so I didn't have to go to school. And I remember finishing this book, and I went, I'm an adult now. Because of what was going on in that novel. So this is the thing. I don't have, and I still don't. I don't have a snobbish attitude towards literature. I will read a dime store novel. I will read a romance. I'll read. That's why I have so much. That's why I have so many detective novels. So the other thing I remember reading James Clavell's novels like Shogun and Taipan. And the thing about these novels is that they know how to tell a big sweeping story. And I still try to do that. But when I was 14, I read stuff that I guess 14-year-olds would read. Like, actually, that's not true. I read Tom Jones. No 14-year-old is reading that. They should though. I read a lot was comics. I'm still very much inspired by, let's call it, mass market entertainment. By mass market stuff. I love horror. I love sci-fi. I'm not saying I watch soap operas, but if you put me in front of a TV, I will watch it and probably not move. And that sort of everything on the kitchen sink attitude, I also bring into, the stuff I write, and I bring it into the characters. Certainly into the characters' knowledge of the world. Even if I am not big on, say, pop culture, my characters tend to be. I remember once spent a whole weekend watching old American TV just for my character to talk about how a character's hair looks in Dynasty. Because that's the stuff that they're interested in, and I'm interested in it as well. Actually, it's not that important, bringing personal experiences. One, because being a writer, I'm some sort of a nerd. I haven't experienced that much. I think it's more bringing empathy. And I think if you've experienced something that empathy and experience are not the same things. I think experience is important, but if I were going to wait for experience to write about most of the stuff I've written about, I probably wouldn't write it. I think it's more of, as I said, empathy and sympathy and understanding. And in the absence of that, a really keen sense of observation. Because I know writers who hate people, and they're really good writers. They just let us observe. And I guess it comes back to like the very first question. It is, again, detective work. And I do the detective work, I think, and that's how I end up with, with the characters. Writing for TV and writing fiction, they're similar in a lot of levels in the sense that you're still dealing with characters and you're still dealing with complicated characters put in complicated situations and observing how they react to that. And I think that's important. I think all the things that make a good book character great is what makes a good television or film character great. But writing for TV is different. One, the economy. As I said, I write pretty long novels. 60 pages is the entirety of some TV scripts. In 60 pages, my characters just woke up and yawned. Writing for TV is a lot like writing for stage in the sense that a huge part of it is collaborative. And you want that in a way because there's a way in which, as a novelist, I can write 4 characters and they seem diverse. That doesn't happen sometimes with screen. That sometimes you actually do need other people in the room. You do need co-writers. You do need a writer's room. You do need people bouncing off ideas. I'm not sure why it's different, but it is. A script that finally makes it into the actor's hands is a product of collaboration, of negotiation, of ideas that seem great on Thursday seeming bad on Friday. And constantly writing. Sometimes you're writing all the way up to before the director yells cut. Sometimes some of the most complicated writing happens on set because your character, your actor sees it in a different way, or they're bringing a different energy today than the day before, or something that, and this happens all the time, something that seems pretty fantastic on page becomes kind of inert when you're acting it, or it doesn't read the way you want. So to be open to all those changes, and to be open to rewrites, and to be open to whatever circumstance leading to a change or a script going in a different direction than you planned before, that's all part of the process. And I think that's one of the differences between writing for screen as opposed to books. I mean, it goes without saying, if you're writing scripts, language is important. It was important for me to head back to Jamaica just to sort of soak up how people are speaking. Because language is always changing. Language is always dynamic and it's kinetic. And if hobble, let's sort of make it, I guess, say undercut sometimes shows like this, is when you have a perspective of Jamaican language or in a language that's actually kind of old. That's actually sort of outdated in the sense that language is always changing, it's always dynamic, and you want your characters to reflect that. And the best way to do that is to, go back to the country. I am actually in Jamaica quite a bit. If for no other reason than as I tell more and more contemporary stories, I have to be around the contemporary place to do it. Before Millie, how do I put this? Before I started writing Millie, the last book I wrote set in Jamaica ended in 1991 when I was still there. I wouldn't have dared write about 2020 or 2022 without going back first. And I think because language is also a conversation, and it's a back and forth, and it's an exchange of ideas, and you kind of have to be in the country, you kind of have to be in the scene and soaking it up to do it.